We'll be talking about tides and how that affects the way our shores look and how they're going to look in the future. So one of the questions that people did really well on are why we have seasons. So there's a diagram here showing the Earth's tilt relative to the different seasons relative to the sun. So we're coming up on the winter solstice, which is December 21st. For us, it's the least daylight of the year. And that's because most people seem to already know that's when we're angled most away from the sun, and the southern hemisphere is getting the direct sunlight. So it's why even when it's sunny, it doesn't feel especially as warm as it does in the summer. And it's also why I actually love looking at the UV index, which is offered on a lot of weather apps like on your phone. And it's actually really amazing to me how low the UV index is right now relative to, say, like midday right now versus midday in the summer. And it's why I allow myself not to have the sunblock fight with my children all winter long, because even though it's good to wear sunblock, the amount of actual radiation from the sun that you're getting is actually orders of magnitude less because of that oblique angle that we're having. And the reason I sort of bring this up is because a lot of people actually think it has to do with distance from the sun, which actually isn't true. And the reason that we know that that's not true is that this is one that people in our poll didn't know, and I didn't really know it either until I started looking into it. But the Earth is actually at what's called perihelion in its orbit on January 3rd. So that's winter for us. And so it really, our distance from the sun has nothing really to do with our seasons. It's all about the tilt and the angle at which we're receiving the sun's rays. But this elliptical orbit of the Earth around the sun does have some very minor influence on some tidal behaviors, which we'll get to in the next few slides. So why do we have tides? I think everybody seemed to understand that tides have to do with the gravitational pull of the moon, and that is definitely the largest factor. So here's a diagram where it shows the moon pulling this bulge of water, which I think makes sense on the intuitive level. The moon is the closest body to us, and so its gravitational pull, even though compared with the sun, the moon is very, very small, because it's so much closer, it exerts the most gravitational pull on the water of the Earth. The opposite tidal bulge at the other side of the planet has to do with inertia. And that gets much more into the physics that I've watched some YouTube videos on this. And you have to have a really solid understanding of physics to understand exactly why that happens. But I'm just going to stop with inertia today. But there's this double bulge with the waters of Earth. And as the Earth rotates on its axis, we essentially travel through those bulges multiple times in a day, twice per day. So we go through one bulge during one portion of the day and the other bulge through the other part of the day, which explains high tides. That's not the only thing that explains tides, though. So in this little sort of equation, pseudo equation down here, gravitational pull of the moon is written the largest because it exerts the most influence. But the gravitational pull of the sun actually has a relatively large influence as well. It has about half the gravitational pull of the moon. So the position of the moon and the sun and the Earth in alignment they basically determine whether or not we have really high or really low tides. So when the moon and the sun are in direct alignment, then they're pulling in the same direction. This has to kind of we're flashing back to vector diagrams in high school physics. When the vectors are moving in the same way, they're additive. So the gravity's pulling extra hard, and we get what's called spring tides when the moon and the sun are in alignment. And if you think about which side of the moon we're seeing here, when the moon is between the sun and the Earth, we're seeing the dark side. So that's a new moon. So that's when we have what is called a spring tide, and that is not a seasonal reference. It refers to, in the olden days, people talking about the tides springing forth very vigorously. And then when the moon is on the other side of Earth here, but still in alignment with the sun, that's when we have a full moon, and that's also a spring tide. Those are our larger tides, our higher tides. So I have on here, we've got the gravitational pull of the moon has the largest influence, gravitational pull of the sun, and whether those bodies are in alignment, or if the moon is at a 90-degree angle, like the quarter moons. Those are called neap tides, and they're lesser tides. They're not as extreme. So we have a king tide happening December 13th, 14th, and 15th. And so that's why we're having this talk today, is to talk about these biggest tides of the year. They're cool to see. And it's kind of interesting to think about why they happen. So every month there's a high tide. Yeah, there are high tides with the new moon and the full moon. The reason that we are having king tides right now is that where the moon is on its elliptical orbit also plays a role. So when the moon is closer to us on this elliptical orbit, it's called when the moon is at its perigee, it's closest in its orbit, and so gravity is the strongest. And so it just so happens that, let's see, we've got December 14th is our new moon. So that's when we would already expect a spring tide, because new moon is when the sun and the moon are both pulling in the same direction. And then the moon is at perigee actually tonight, or today, the 12th. The moon's at its perigee. So it's at its closest location to Earth in its elliptical orbit. And then an additional factor is that the sun is exerting a relatively stronger gravitational influence because of that January 3rd perihelion, where we are at our closest orbital distance from the sun. So all of those things together, layering on top of each other, make these extra high tides, and it makes for some very interesting phenomena that we can see, and it allows us to think about the future as well. So why are we interested in king tides? For one, it's a really cool chance to see unusual wildlife that is seeking refuge in higher tide areas than usual. This is a ridgeways rail, which lives out in the salt marsh and has to sort of move up to higher tide areas when we've got these high tides. This is a salt marsh harvest mouse, which every high tide I go out and look for these. I still haven't seen one, but really your king tide is going to be your best chance to see these mice that live in the pickleweed and again, they need to find high tide refuge areas when we have super high tides. I've seen seals out in sort of the channels of the Balin, the flooded channels of the Balins, which is cool. And Claire alerted us to these fish called grunions that actually occurred during king tides slightly south of here, I think from central to southern California, and they come out and lay their eggs apparently during king tides. So that's pretty awesome. During our highest tides, 6 or so hours after that, you get some of your lowest tides. So it's also a great time for tide pooling. So if you miss the king tides and the high tide floods, you can maybe go out during low tides and catch some really great tide pooling at the coast. So I'm going to hand it over to Claire to talk more about how we can use king tides to visualize future sea level rise, because it's not another thing that we can think about when we're out looking at the king tides. All right, over to you, Claire.
Thank you, Kathleen. It's always so good to learn that over and over again. Doesn't stick for me, but I want to add about the grunions, because I did a little more research. I used to go as a kid in Southern California to see the grunions run in the sand, and probably several of you have seen it too. You can see it as far north as Cayucas, so it could be a good weekend trip when we're allowed to do that kind of thing again, except it's in May and June. So it's the high tides we have that time of year, not now. But they're really super cool to see. And there are times when you're allowed to collect them for food purposes too. So I'm going to share my slides, and I'm going to be talking about how king tides are useful to us to learn about what the future is going to look like. But I wanted to, not, I'm seeing a lot of different people on the screen, and I just wanted to shout out that we've got a lot of people from our California Naturalist class, and it's really fun in the chat to see alumni from the Naturalist class talking with current people in the class. So I encourage you, if you are up for it, when we're in gallery view, to turn your video on. We'll go back to it for questions at the end. Don't worry about putting it in gallery view now, but I'd love to have people see each other and get to know each other. Oh, we also use some imagery from Ron Horry, who's in our audience, a wonderful photographer. So we're going to be talking a little bit too about how you can get involved as a photographer, and Hannah is going to share that at the end. All right, I'm going to go to sharing screen, and I'm going to go to my presentation and go to view. Oops, and I'm going to start at the first slide instead of the last slide. Sorry about that. We were doing a little practice run. Okay, so this is a wonderful picture I found off of a City of Palo Alto report. This is one of the places you can go visit easily in the Palo Alto Baylands. It's the oyster path that goes from the parking lot area near the Interpretive Center up towards Bixby Park and the wastewater treatment plant back in this area. So as Kathleen was explaining, tides cause water to come up and water to roll out, but climate change is causing water to just come up a little bit by little bit over time. The sea levels are rising, and a king tide is generally over 9 feet, and our highest high tides usually are more in the 8-foot range. So it's about a foot higher that we can see into the future. And so I think everybody understands the concept of sea level rise, but I thought this was an interesting slide to share, that it's not just that we have more water. And I also learned that it's not just water from the ice caps and glaciers melting. It's also added water because of all the groundwater pumping we're doing. We're kind of drying out our sponge called Earth and putting more of that water into the oceans. But most of it is ice melting. And then also, as a liquid heats, it expands. So the thermal expansion also causes the sea to rise. So you add those, the red and the blue. I like that they did it like an artist would do. They read the red to the blue, and they got the purple line up here to show the combination of those two causes. And so what are we going to do about that? Well, we all need to do something about it, all of us individually. And one of the things that's happening during this pandemic is that we're doing something whether we like it or not, which is not being in our cars as much. And we can do a lot as far as what kinds of energy we're using. And Palo Alto has already, they've got a sustainability climate action plan, and already since 1990, which was one of the dates chosen as a baseline, we've seen a 35% reduction in greenhouse gases. So greenhouse gases, I think everybody understands that it's not just carbon dioxide, it's also things like methane, which is why working on replacing natural gas sources is so important. We have a lot of leakage, for instance, of natural gas that is causing, and methane in natural gas is a much more powerful greenhouse gas than CO2. So anyway, the city is coming up with a bunch of different steps, and we will all need to change what we're doing as well. But you can see they have a whole bunch of different plans to get us down to this last remaining blue square by 2030, just 10 years from now. So we got to get busy, and the whole world has to get busy, not just Palo Alto, obviously. So there's also changes people have made to the shoreline based on wanting more space to do what we like to do, like build homes and shopping centers and airports and golf courses. So the land has changed over time, and that has caused a number of issues that we're hoping to learn from and go back towards the way the land used to be. And so you can see from this historical ecology slide, if you haven't been to San Francisco Estuaries Institute, SFEI, San Francisco Estuary Institute's website, I highly recommend checking out their projects on historical ecology. They have maps all over the Bay Area showing how things used to be And then they have links to the wonderful Oakland Museum maps that were created with a project of Trish Mulvey's locally here to try and get us to see how our creeks have changed over time. So anyway, I highly recommend checking out SFEI. But so as you can see here, that's the same spot. You can see the Cooley Landing little bulb out here on the historical ecology map, and then the same one here on the current day situation from a Google Earth slide. So we have added a lot of fill, and you'll see in another slide here just how much of the area of baylands. I can't remember the percentage. I think it's 70 or 80% of our total baylands for the whole San Francisco Bay Area has been filled. So here's the slide I was talking about where you can see the actual land uses and where the fill has been filled in that area. So here's Cooley Landing up here at the top and Palo Alto Baylands down in here. So the marshland provides a lot of ecosystem services, but historically it had a gradation of elevations. So there was some upland habitat like these willow groves on the left. A lot of our creeks meandered from side to side, and they created these things called saucels, which is the Spanish word for willow grove, that had a lot of habitat, but also had the ability to absorb storm surges and things like that. But since we filled in a lot of this area, when the storms surge and when the floods come down the creeks, like San Francisco Creek, then we have a lot more flooding problem than we would have if we had left the natural marsh intact. The other issue is a lot of our creeks have been dammed. San Francisco is one of them. And so these marshlands were built by all the sediments that ran down the creeks. We have very erosive geology in California. So the creeks carry a lot of sediment. And sediment is a problem when the water's turbid and the fish can't find their way around, or their food, or their gills get clogged, or the insects they eat, their gills get clogged. But sediment coming in pulses down during a storm event, they can survive, but they don't experience that anymore, which is a problem for a number of reasons. One, we don't get those sediments building up to form marshlands out here. But the other one is that we don't get the gravels coming through that then get washed by the next flood that provides spawning habitat. So we've got a lot of sediment held up behind dams, and that's an issue we're going to have to solve both for the baylands and for our creeks. So here's a nice cutaway image that I found at the Bay Institute's website. Now it turns out it's also one that's used in a Palo Alto report on horizontal levees. So we'll talk about them twice, but I just wanted to really quickly show this one because this is the way things used to work. But this little blue line is not, that's added as a human invention that I'll show you. Although it's really the way things were in the natural situation, because the creeks were bringing fresh water flow down that would then spread out across the bayland. So it's an estuary, and an estuary is where fresh water and salt waters combine. So, but we'll talk about what this blue line is here in a minute. But I just wanted to show that there's these different zonations of vegetation that give the organisms the opportunity to move from one. I don't know if you could see my cursor. Can you guys see my cursor? Okay, so if you're a harvest mouse and you're living down in the pickleweed and the tide starts coming up, historically you had upland habitat as refugia to run off into, same for the rails. But now we have so many dikes that are not vegetated and they don't provide any habitat values. So the critters are more restricted in their movement. And another thing is that when you have ecologically, when you have an upland habitat next to a marshland habitat, you end up with species that don't live in either, that just like that transition zones. You get more biodiversity where ecosystems come together. So this is just one of the citizen science projects that you could help with to help figure out and watch the change in organisms over time. It's called iNaturalist, and probably a number of you have used it. But this is just an image that I snapped off of iNaturalist when I said, what lives down in the Palo Alto Baylands? And it showed me 334 different plants varieties. You can see the ones with little pink squares in the corner. These are introduced, so they're not part of the ecosystem. They didn't, I mean, they're trying to make themselves part of the ecosystem, but they don't provide nearly the habitat value because they didn't co-evolve with the local insects that eat them to move them up the food chain. I did the same thing for birds, and there's 179 species of birds that have been seen out in the Baylands. And this is just a few of them, but there's a beautiful array of different kinds of wildlife, some of them living more in the uplands like the song sparrows, and some of them like the white pelicans that are spending more time eating fish in the water. So you heard Kathleen mention these two endangered species, the Ridgway rail, which I wish they had left the clapper rail, but we have these people in taxonomy who are called the splitters. And the splitters got to this poor bird and gave the southern, I think it's the Southern California rails are now the clapper rail. And we got the name Ridgway, which is named for a person who had no E in his name. And that's also makes it tough. But the Ridgway's rail is one that lives in the cordgrass, and the salt marsh harvest mouse, as you can see in this picture, lives in the pickleweed. And so they both need those specific zones, but they need to also be able to escape those zones when they're inundated. This is a cool tool that Kathleen found from the San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission, Adapting to Rising Tides. And we'll share these slides with people who've been here. So if you want to get the links later, we'll have those available to you. It is taking into consideration that sea level is rising, that we haven't got infrastructure in place to deal with it yet, but so it doesn't show, when I show the sea level rising, it doesn't show that there are plans for changes in levees and land use. But it takes into consideration a little bit of effort, I guess, towards greenhouse gas reduction, but maybe not totally optimistic about where we'll get. So hopefully we can reach more optimistic goals. But so here's what it shows us when you get to 1 foot of sea elevation rise locally. So basically the salt marshes become inundated. We decided that yellow line, since San Francisco Creek is the county border, that must be a county border in there. So the light blue shows where water levels will come to. And then this is with 3 feet of sea level rise. And nobody knows exactly when that might occur, but it's sometimes towards the end of the century, is my understanding. And so we've got some time, but not a lot. So it's time to take some action. And we'll talk real briefly about what those actions are that are planned. One of the plans is to try and create more of our old, the historic zonation with Upland Habitat. And I'm hoping we can do a lot of that. We're gonna have to find a lot of sediment, that's one issue. But so here's 3 projects we're gonna just briefly mention, 2 of them in Palo Alto. Well, one of them is a plan that's being created, and then one's an actual pilot project. And then a more regional plan by Valley Water, which is not exactly a county agency, but it's a regional agency for the South Bay area that works on lots of things, flooding as well as sea level rise and water supply. So this is the Palo Alto plans list of strategy. I'm not going to read all through them, but you can go to the website and check it out. And they are open to public input. The plan is still being drafted through at least the summer of 2021 is what I understood from the website. We've got some things we can do starting from the bottom. There's some things we can do in the upland areas, and Grassroots Ecology is working on some of those at trying to build and restore some rain garden areas, so that, I don't know if people are familiar with the Southgate neighborhood, but we're doing some revegetating of one of the early stormwater projects that was done there to get water to slow spread and sink. That's one of my favorite lines for explaining green stormwater infrastructure. You want the water to not all go off in one big flash of runoff from our hardscaped areas, and we've got a lot of hardscaped areas. So all the rooftops and roads, when the rain hits it, it just goes shooting off into creeks and causes flooding and erosion and other issues, pollution. So slowing, spreading, and sinking. And then we've got things we can do to actually move infrastructure up, so and improve stormwater pumps to get the water moving off of the land. And then in the baylands, so getting up to the top level here, working on the levees and hopefully making them also habitat and not just hard structures. So here's how Palo Alto is going to be constructing a horizontal levee project. So that's what they call creating some upland transition zone habitat. And this is super cool, which I think is going to be really interesting to see how it works. I was a biologist and then went to study environmental engineering. And what I really wanted to study was this kind of use of water. How can we take wastewater and put it to beneficial use? At the time when I was thinking about graduate school in 1980, dates me, but there you have it. There was a project up in Humboldt. Arcata takes a lot of their wastewater and puts it into a marshland so that it gets an extra polishing and treating, but it also provides for some ecosystem services. And Palo Alto has one small project like that in the form of the Emily Rensel freshwater marsh, where about 1 million gallons per day comes from the treatment plant, creates marsh or a actual surface water area for waterfowl. But this would help to create some, it'll help the vegetation get going. I'm a little concerned about how much we use. Now it's saltier water than the fresh water that comes down from rain runoff, but that's actually a good thing out here. But one of the things that a lot of people aren't aware of, that the treatment plant outfall, which is on our guided tour from Google Maps that we'll show you in a minute, but that water is converting salt marsh to freshwater marsh. It's a especially problem in the San Jose area because they have many more millions of gallons of fresher water coming from their treatment plant. But we have to be careful not to add too much water that's not salty, or we'll lose the pickleweed and cordgrass habitat. But anyway, it's going to be a really interesting project to watch, and hopefully it's successful, and hopefully the funding will come through to do more of it. So this is where that's going to take place, down here in the Baylands. The yellow, I'm sorry, I've blocked us with our pictures here. The initial location, oh dear, Kathleen, can you jump in and tell me, because I've forgotten what the difference between the yellow and the red.
Yeah, so it looked like the yellow was the initial idea, but it's more likely to be in the red location. So that's
cool.
where the pilot, the pilot horizontal levee could be. Okay,
interesting. Well, I'm going to be really intrigued to watch this. Right here at the edge of the red square is where there's a pipe that comes through to the Emily Rensel Marsh. So I mentioned that the Emily Rensel Marsh has this freshwater pond, and it's off the picture up here. That is freshwater from, or relatively freshwater from the treatment plant. But because this area was blocked from tidal flow by Bixby Park, which used to be a landfill, there was no tidal action coming in here. So there's a pipe coming through under the road here that comes out and brings tidal flow back into this marsh to try and make it stay sort of marsh-like. And then the water gets pumped out into Matadero Creek over here. Anyway, it's all a very interesting area, and you can learn more by going on our Google Earth walk and clicking on some of the images. But it's a very convenient location to use wastewater from the treatment plant for helping with that restoration. So adding some upland habitat and creating a slope for a transitional marsh habitat, I think it's going to be a really cool. It's going to be a big challenge to make it happen everywhere. I'm worried a little bit that, like with San Francisco Creek, we'll have to have some hardscaping like the flood walls too to protect us. But it's certainly, wherever we can do something that's going to add habitat at the same time is good with me. And then regionally, we've got to figure it out. And so there's a project that's getting the help of a bunch of agencies, and each municipality is responsible for working with that agency. And you can see it's divided up into chunks here. So each of these numbered zones is getting has planning going on for how are we going to deal with these edges and try and do it in a ecologically sensitive but a way that protects human infrastructure. So and I just want to mention that it's not just the baylands, but it's the creeks that we're going to have to work on. And locally, that's the Joint Powers Authority that's working with Valley Water to make sure that we aren't, because the tides at 101 and San Francisco, the tides go in and the tides go out, and it makes a big difference in what ends up coming back up our storm drains if we've got the water coming down from the hills at the same time as it's going up from the ocean. So these are all the agencies involved in the shoreline feasibility studies. Federally, it's the Army Corps of Engineers, which has gotten a lot better over the years. Some old timers remember the Army Corps as being an agency of concrete and not a lot of caring about the ecosystem, but they've got it. I mean, I'm sure it varies from administration to administration how much support they're getting for doing ecologically friendly projects, but in general, I think they're getting better. Then we have regional and state agencies like Valley Water and Coastal Conservancy, and then each municipality will be a study partner as well. All right. Oh, wow. I think I finished almost on time. Well, I have two more things to share with you before I hand it off to Hannah to talk about our participatory science project we're promoting. We've got that, it's a new term. It went from citizen science to community science. Now we're calling it participatory science, which I think is good. We'll see. But I still get stuck on citizen science because that was the original one I learned. All right, so if you want to go out and help learn about what the king tides show us, you can use a project that Hannah's going to explain to you. But we've created another guide for you, which is on Google Earth. And you could either just, watch the presentation ahead of time and go out on your own. You can run it as a presentation. I'm going to demonstrate it in a second, but you can also just click on the different spots you're thinking about going to and check it out. You can also put Google Earth on a smartphone. And the cool thing about that is that you can see where you are in relation to the different points if you make sure you click on the little arrow on the map, on the icons, but I think I'll be able to show you that. But first, I'm going to go to this link, which shares with you how to get tides. So that, probably a lot of you have looked up tide tables, and there's different websites that'll help you do that. This is NOAA's website. And so I just put in Palo Yacht Harbor, which is close to the Interpretive Center. It's just down the road past the parking lot. It's that boat launch out there. And then I put in the dates from December 12th to January 13th. You can only do 31 days at a time and plot it like this, but it shows you the two king tides that we're going to have this winter. So you've got, oh, well, that's interesting. When I did this as a practice run, it let me, oh, there, now it's working. Maybe I just hadn't clicked on it, so it wasn't actively engaging with the website. So as you run your cursor along, you're seeing the little boxes pop up. So I can go to this really high king tide here and see, oh, that's Monday. It's at 11:18. That's convenient. It'll be light out, and it's 9.51 feet. And then here's that inertia bulge, the smaller high tide, which is only 6.88 feet at 1 in the morning. So we don't want to go to that one unless you're a night owl. But and then the next morning, about an hour later, is the next high tide at 9.38 feet on Tuesday. So Monday is going to be the highest high tide. So make sure you wear a double layer of mask if you go out that morning, because there'll probably be a lot of people. But you can also go to a lot of different places to see this. So you can spread out along the baylands to see king tides, or even out the ocean if you want to. And then January, the same thing. And then you can use it also for low tides. So I think this is probably partly why the Grunion aren't running. Oh, wait, no, they do like, okay, I'm sorry. I'm just thinking out loud about trying to go see tide pools. So I'm thinking about low tides, and then that made me think about grunions because I miss going out to the ocean to see them. Anyway, the low tides right now are after dark. So it's cool to have this tool available to you. You can download the annual tide charts too and have them available to you to figure out a good time to go out to the ocean to see the tide pools. All right, now I'm going to switch to our Google Earth map. And if you, we provide that link to you, you will get to where you can see it as a map, but also the opportunity to present. So you click here on present, and it'll run through each of the slides, which some of them are repeated from our presentation that we just did. Now on my phone in the bottom right corner, I guess this is part of the reason I've been confused, is on my phone there's a little arrow that's not here on the desktop. It's that little arrow that there's a row of 4 icons, and that's the one that'll show you where you are. So if you're down here parked at the Interpretive Center parking lot, which is out about out here. Oh, P for parking. I'm a little slow here. I haven't had enough of my coffee yet. So if you're down here and you want to walk out to here, for instance, you'll see your little blue dot moving along. So you'll know how close you are relatively if you've made sure you've clicked that little arrow. But if you click on one of the images or this little pin here, like for San Francisco Creek, it'll open up a window that shows you an image of San Francisco Creek. And this is actually an image of the creek. Do we have more than one in here? Oh yeah, we do. So this is the one I was expecting to see. The one that I added is one that was taken by somebody who put it on Google Earth. So you can find some cool images on Google Earth of different spots just by going to Street View. But this is what it looks like actually out at that spot. It's where the steelhead trout come running out of the bay to go try and spawn in our creek. But some of these are farther up where you can see the flood walls that have been built for protection of, this is right at 101. This is Yemen's auto body shop. And that's the same spot at low tide. So you can see how the tides really influence the creek. So yeah, there's the farthest up that we have spots to check out is Cooley Landing. And then we haven't added anything farther south than what, Kathleen, I guess these are the Emily Rensel freshwater ponds I was talking about. You can go, and I saw one time, I saw about 100 white pelicans fishing in that pond at the same time. And they are just amazing to watch. They do this really cool dance. If there's a number of them fishing together, they line up and they circle around with their bills going like little sewing machines. So they must be doing something with their feet to scatter the fish into one area, and then they just are going up and down like a bunch of little, they either remind me of sewing machines working or oil rigs pumping. They're just going up and down and filling their bills with fish. So that's a really cool, beneficial reuse project, and I'm looking forward to seeing more of those. And now I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Hannah to talk about the community science, participatory science project.
Thanks, Claire. If you guys have questions for Claire or Kathleen, keep putting them in the chat and we'll still have some time to go over those. Okay. So I just have a short little couple of slides on the California King Tides project. So this is just kind of in concert with the interpretive guide they were giving you guys. It's kind of another activity that you can do while you're out there. And it's a way for you to visualize the king tides and high tides, what sea level rise might look like around where you live. And so the California King Tides project happens every year. And this year, the king tides were in November 15th, 16th, and then the ones in December 13th through 15th. So hopefully this presentation kind of springboards you to go participate and explore. It's a project that's managed by the California Coastal Commission, but it was launched technically in 2010. And it's now a worldwide project, the King Tides Project, which covers like two different shores, two different coastlines of the US and Australia, New Zealand, parts of Europe and Asia, which is a pretty cool thing. So it's a very good thing to go check out. I'm gonna go to my next slide. And for the California King Tides Project, of course, it's a statewide community science participatory science program that people all over the state are using to document their shoreline and what future sea level rise will look like by looking at the highest tides. So as Claire is talking about community science, some of you may have already participated in one before, but it's citizen science, community science, and participatory science are kind of all a way to talk about scientific research that's conducted by non-professional scientists. So it's this public participation in scientific research that, in this case, it's kind of participatory monitoring, that we're doing photo monitoring for the California King Tides Project, and those outcomes or data collected often help advance scientific research by improving the scientific community capacity, and also increases public's awareness and understanding of science or phenomena that's happening around them. So I included just a couple maps showing previous years of king tides. And you can see it all the way down the coastline. Of course, we in the Bay Area have a little more coastline close to us. These were 2 different years, but you can use these maps that exist to see what king tides looked like in the year before. And I grabbed a couple examples of that. They have an interactive feature where you can click on dots on the map and see the photos that other people uploaded to the project. This here is in Bear Island, and you can see the details over on the left-hand part of the screen. So this is in February, and there's also a little description here, which is pretty helpful because this is this flooding is due to stormwater overflow. So the tide's coming back in through our stormwater drains, which is kind of connects to what Claire was talking about, groundwater and the stormwater hard surfaces. Where can the water go when we have a lot of hard surfaces and it can't seep back into the groundwater? And this one is a little dramatic, but it is, I don't know, sparks me thinking like, what can we do about this kind of impact? This is in Pacifica, and it can kind of just show you what's a high, when the sea level rises, what a storm surge might look like and the kind of impacts there. So I encourage you guys to go look at what's been added before in previous years, and then also participate this year. So like I was talking about, the king tides photos that people all around the state and you add are helping to document the current flood risk and help you and governments, nonprofits, scientists visualize the impacts of this future sea level rise in a community. And I like this one. It does ground truth and validate climate change models by being able to make those comparisons and predictions. And it also serves as that like living record of change for future generations. And so the photos that are taken can be used or may be used in presentations or exhibitions, on websites, on sea level rise and climate change and coastal initiatives. There also could be used by government agencies for research and planning to assess where the coastline is the most vulnerable, and by scientists to predict future sea level rise. And also teachers and students have access to the photos that can be used for education about our coastal geography and climate change impacts. So how do you participate? It's pretty simple. The California King Tides Project website is very helpful, and there are lots of, there's a step-by-step guide for how to upload your photos, but essentially during the King Tides, 13th through the 15th, take photos of the shoreline where you live, or as you follow the interpretive guide that Claire shared with us. One thing is you do need to have your location services on when you take the photos, but you don't need to upload the photos immediately as you take them. There are two ways to contribute to the project. You can use the app, which is ArcGIS Survey 123. It's free and it's on iPhone and Android. And then you can also upload through your browser, like using on your computer. This King Tides photo upload form, which has a link, which I'll share too, works for both. One, if you click on it and you have the app, it will launch in the app. And if you're in your browser, then you can just open it up in your browser. And this is the information that you are submitting. You submit your picture. And if you have kind of all your metadata permissions on, it should automatically load that in here, but you can also manually edit it. This is a picture I took during the previous King Tides in Palo Alto that I submitted. And so you just need date, time, or photo, date, time, and location. You also they also ask you to add some location names. So I just said Palo Alto Baylands, but you can also make other notes, other observatory data, observational data, as you upload it, and then you just click submit your survey, and you can add as many as you want, as many photos as you would like to add. And oh, I said, yeah, there's a step-by-step guide that I'll share too, which if you have any kind of like technical issues, it's pretty helpful just to like run through that. And here's some more resources that I'll be sharing. This is where you can see the already recorded King Tides observations. So it just links you straight to that story map. And there's also just a plain photo gallery. The California King Tides Project Instagram also kind of will highlight all the perhaps most impactful or interesting photos. There are also some really great field journals for kids or students to kind of guide the observations that they're making about tides, and some educator resources. And if you want to learn a little bit more about the King Tides, global warming, sea level rise, general context, Cal Academy has a pretty great video on that. So yeah, hopefully these kind of all this resources and all the knowledge and information we shared kind of puts you in a great place to go explore on the 13th to the 15th and go through the interpretive guide, stop at any spots that are close to you or interest you, and hopefully you can contribute to the California King Tides Project. It's a really great way for you to be part of a participatory science project and also learn from it too.